Hello, everyone. You're watching Politico Live. My name is Cécile Goujard, and I'm a tech reporter here at Politico. We are thrilled to bring you this discussion on what the present and future European AI framework means for SMEs. We have with us today Eva Meidel, a member of the European Parliament with the European People's Party. She hails from Bulgaria. We also have Lara Ruires, who is the founder and CEO of a startup company named Livia.ai. Her company makes conversational technologies such as chatbots. She's also vice president and a board member of French startup lobby, France Digital. And last but not least, we have Federico Silveira da Silva, who is the senior legal officer at the European consumer organization BUC. Before we begin, a quick reminder, don't forget to submit questions via the Swapcard app in the questions box next to the live stream. And to answer our live poll, what are the main challenges for SMEs in the new AI legislative proposal? You can also tweet about this event with our hashtag #PoliticoAI. The Commission unveiled its plan to regulate AI about a month ago now, so we've all had a time to look at the proposal. Eva, we'll start with you. Do you think the Commission's proposal properly took into account the SME's perspective?
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I think many of us find that it was good timing that this proposal arrived. It was about time that the Parliament, up until now, and the institutions would focus more on the ethical aspects of AI for over the past more than 4 or 5 years. And now it was about this time to take a step forward and to try to look a little bit broader picture when it comes to AI. When it particularly comes to SMEs, I think we need to look at the topic in a way that a couple of years ago, we started talking about the digital revolution. And I think now we are experiencing another renewed wave and a different type of digital revolution. So when it comes to trying to regulate something that is considered a revolution, so to say, we need to know that the legislation that is proposed will perhaps not appeal to everyone at the first moment, and perhaps it will need to go through some tweaks and twists until it gets to the point where this legislation would be, better fit for some. Let's put it this way. When it comes to SMEs, I think we need to answer the question: what sort of SMEs are we talking about? Because what I would like to see is to make sure Europe to be competitive and that this legislation actually helps to foster innovation in Europe, it should try and help the traditional, so to say, SMEs, that they're not the tech startups or the tech unicorns, to develop their business from now onwards in a way that's more competitive, in a way that could take into account data and AI. So I think what's really important for this legislation is to make sure that those tech startups could very well implement that legislation in order for them to be helping that more traditional SMEs in various sectors. Kind of those startups and tech SMEs as well should be the ones paving the way and producing the sort of tools for the traditional SMEs to flourish. And then we could have also this sort of ecosystem kind of that where they collaborate with one another, and the ones that have not had the tech part in their production lines, let's say, or the way their business is set up or the way it operates, could take advantage of the ones that already are there and the legislation supposedly works well for them. And lastly, I think what's important with this legislation is to make sure that those European startups and SMEs are the ones to pave the way of the renewed, even further wave of technological advancements that we want to witness in the next 3, 4, 5, or 10 years ahead of us. So in this way, I think what's very important for this sort of advancements to take place is that the legislation foresees the importance of regulatory sandboxes. If we really want to make sure that certain ideas are implemented, having these national regulatory sandboxes to help the development of AI are very good. They're very needed. They're a step in the right direction to particularly enable innovation. So I'll stop here and I'll be willing to go further at the next round.
Lara, you're the CEO of a startup. What are the parts of the proposal that you particularly like and the one that you find more problematic, and why that is,
Yes, hi. As an AI startup founder and a board member of a French association that represents startups, and an association that is aiming at building a clear and innovation-friendly framework in France, obviously I have a tech startup point of view on that. There are a lot of good points, like the main AI dangerous application have been clearly regulated, and that's a good point, especially because we are all like scared about what AI can do, and it's a good way that it will probably make sure that AI will be used in a proper and ethical way, which is a good point. The main concerns that we have is that we saw that a hollow AI framework might have some impact, especially for those who are building AI tech in the high-risk potential applications. Most of the concern that we might have concerns the high-risk AI application and its interpretation, which is always problematic. What we anticipate is that it might discourage startups from offering certain services, notably in the legal tech or HR tech, because they might be labeled as high risk. And sometimes lines might be blurry. It's not easy to be sure that you fall into the high risk categorization, and being labeled high risk have impacts following the legislation. Although we are also very happy that the idea of the sandboxes has been validated, because it's really important to have those freedom to test things. Startup that wants to scale on the market and raise funds will need to comply with the ex-ante regulation, and the principal concern that we have is that it might dislocate resources from the R&D to the compliance, and thus it will slow maybe the pace of innovation in Europe for the startups that will fall into the high-risk applications. And with limited resources, we can anticipate that startups will avoid certain AI applications into these sectors that can be more risky. And also the risk and the concern that we have is the ex-ante regulation impose that any kind of change, modification, improvement of the algorithm might, if I'm correct, need a new compliance process, which can be tough for startups that don't have huge team to deal with that.
Moving on to you, Federico, how did you welcome the proposal? Do you have concerns similar to those that Lara just shared?
Well, thank you very much for inviting us, first of all, and good morning to everyone. To be very honest, we're disappointed with this proposal. We had been long calling for the Commission to put forward the concrete legal text to regulate this technology that, as was mentioned by our previous speaker, that everyone is concerned about. So from that perspective, we do welcome that the European Commission has put forward a legal and concrete proposal. This being said, when we look at the proposal, when we look at the structure, at its rules, and more concretely, when we dive more concretely into its provisions, we do realize that it falls short of our expectations, and our expectations being a high level of consumer protection. So just to mention a couple of points that we believe are really missing. The first one is, of course, related to the scope. I think the scope of the proposal will be discussed thoroughly over the next few weeks and months. And why is that? It's because the proposal focuses almost exclusively on high-risk AI, leaving outside of its rules low and medium risk AI. And from that perspective, from our perspective, this is a mistake, because what we believe to be the most balanced position when we regulate such a revolution, such a technology, is to ensure that all AI, regardless of low, medium, or high risk, complies with a certain a set of minimum rules, a set of minimum principles, such as transparency, such as accountability, fairness, non-discrimination. And this is not what happens at the moment, where we only have a very specific number of high-risk AI, which would be subject to such rules. And this, for us, it's something that should be revised and addressed, hopefully by the co-legislators in the months to come. A second point that we would like to address, and it's somehow related to the first point, is the lack of consumer dimension, consumer perspective. Of course, innovation is important, and we would like innovation to flourish in Europe, as all Europeans do. But it is important that innovation is regulated and clearly contextualized within a set of legal and clear rules that also ensure a high level of consumer protection. This is even more important, again, when we're talking about such technology. And what we're seeing in this proposal is that it clearly lacks a consumer dimension. It does not put in place concrete rights to consumers. I've already mentioned a few principles that should be applicable. So a right that a consumer calls for transparency from an AI, a right for a consumer not to be discriminated by an AI, rights of access to justice as well, for example. So this is something that is clearly lacking from the current proposal, and that we hope that co-legislators will work on it and will improve, because at the end of the day, consumers will be probably the most threatened and will be the most harmed by these technologies. So it's really, really important with this proposal that we get this right. And just one point on one of the provisions that has been the most discussed at the moment, which is Article 5, which sets a list of prohibitions for AI. And of course, we welcome this provision in principle. It has been one of our previous demands in the past years when we were discussing a future proposal on AI. But again, here, this provision also needs to be clarified and improved in certain aspects to make sure that its application is done right in the right manner. So, for example, there is a prohibition of an AI, but it is only prohibited if it has a link with the harm, if it harms the physical or psychological element of someone, if it provokes a physical or a psychological harm. And our question is, why limiting these type of provisions to physical or psychological harm? Why not include economic harm as well? So on top of this concern, these prohibitions are written in a way that is quite complex, and unfortunately, some of the wording used is not clearly defined in the definitions of the proposal or in a recital. So we would need to make sure that, although it is a very good idea, we need to make sure that this Article 5 and the list of prohibition is applied in the best possible manner to make sure that in the end the provision maximizes its possibilities.
Lara, you touched on that list of high-risk AI users and what that, how that could impact startups, how it could be interpreted, and all the money going from R&D to compliance. How could lawmakers sort of make this risk more startup-friendly? What could they add to make it easier for you, to respect and to follow these obligations?
Yes. I think what might lack is some clarity on the technical tools for compliance, because there are some guidelines, and it's still blurry what startups should do, what are the process that they should follow, how much time it will take to get those to be compliant with those kind of regulations. So this is what is a little bit it's a lack for us that we notice. Also, I think the high risk application has been like there has been an effort to define it very well, and we look at the parts on the HR tech. We saw that it's like high risk for when you want to hire someone, when you want to lay someone off, or you want to like switch the job within the company. So I think it has been like properly anticipated. But I think when you are in the middle of deploying an algorithm within a company, sometimes probably you are not quite sure if it falls into the high risk application. So it's devil is always in the details, and startups, and because there are more and more AI startups on the field, will focus on sometimes on very specific problems to solve, and they will not be sure if they fall into the regulation or not, and it's not always easy to know that. So maybe we need to try to find a way to make things more clear at the beginning. Should I fall into the regulation? Should I not fall? That's the use case I want to tackle, and what should I do? And especially there is also one concern that we want to raise is that sometimes, and that's my case, for instance, with my startups, we provide generalist AI technology, and we don't know how it might be used because it's the general technology. It can be used in different way, and I know that in the value chain, we know that there is a lot of the stakeholder that need to comply with those regulations, but sometimes we don't know how it will be used. So we don't know how to comply with it because we don't know how it can be used. So that's something is difficult because you don't have all the time like a specific AI for a specific problem to solve. Sometimes you use generic AI to solve like various problems, and we need help to be sure that we can still provide those kind of technology without having the risk of being not following the legislation because it's not properly said.
Eva, what do you think of what Lara just said? Do you think some of the obligations for the high-risk AI users should maybe include some exceptions for startups, or should be clearer?
Well, I have to say that I've always had a very clear mindset as a policymaker. Already in the previous mandate, in legislation where the word startup was not even mentioned once, and in various legislation where the aim was not so much to focus on SMEs, I think I've proven that I want to think, so to say, first in that manner. So, of course, I see and hear the concerns that Lara has mentioned, and in myself, I believe that that's also the way we should go forward. It's very important, as I said in the beginning, that this ecosystem finds a way to work together. So on one side, you have the startups and the SMEs that are confident with these technologies, and on the other side, you have those SMEs that are not confident with this technology. So they all need to find a way to exist together and to flourish together. So the better legislation we produce for that sector with more specificalities and tools that could help them understand and basically in this way bring less the bureaucracy to be much less for them. It would be easier for them to collaborate and work with this part of the SMEs that have not found solutions that entail AI, and that could those solutions in the long run help them grow.
Federico, how do we balance the needs that startups have, but also consumer safety?
I mean, as I said in my previous speaking point, I think it's important to ensure that there's innovation and that companies can flourish. But equally important, if not more, is to ensure that normally the weaker party on these type of transactions, which is the consumer, because the consumer at the end of the day has not all the information that the manufacturers have. So the right way to balance is again what we believe to be the right solution to AI and to this technology is to ensure that we put in place a legal text. In this case, we have a proposal, but we improve this proposal to ensure that there's a concrete risk-based approach or a real risk-based approach. In the current proposal, we've listened to the Commission explaining that this is a risk-based approach. The problem is that the risk-based approach is only focusing on high risk. And as I said earlier, we need to make sure that all AI needs to comply with a certain set of rules. And then the higher the risk of an AI, the stricter the rules will be. And that way we could safeguard not only consumers, first of all, but also ensure that companies that are dealing with lower risk AI will not need to comply with the same rules that the higher risk AI. So this is really something that is key for us. And of course, we've heard already some arguing that the AI, which does not fall under the current proposal, is being regulated by the GDPR or other types of EU laws. But it is important to note that this proposal is a proposal that is really aimed at AI, while the other laws that are in place are not. So it's important that we make sure that all type of AI is addressed and regulated in the most consistent manner. And that is why we propose that the scope is enlarged and that some sort of basic rules are applied. Because if we look at one of the provisions, which is Article 52, and it is one of the provisions that establishes that certain AI needs to comply with transparency rules. But the problem with this provision is that it is only addressing 3 types of AI rules. So if, for example, a consumer is chatting with a chatbot, the consumer should be aware that this is a chatbot. If the consumer is looking at a video online and it is a deep fake, the consumer should be informed that this is a deep fake. Of course, we welcome this provision, but it's too short. Again, it really only addresses a very short number of AI. And that is why we believe that the proposal should be more, the proposal and the co-legislature should be more ambitious and make sure that the consumer protection in the end is strengthened.
These AI rules are the first in the world, and there's a global race to master artificial intelligence. Lara, could these rules make it easier or harder for startups to become the next big AI companies or to bring to the market new innovations on a global level?
I think that regulation will not help innovation. It's necessary. We need it because we need the world to be better. So it's a good point that some regulation exists for sure, but it's not something that will help us to go faster. But a good point, and I think it was really important, is that this regulation might apply to any kind of company that wants to operate within the European territory. And that's a good way of doing it, because the worst scenario for us would have to have a European regulation that just applied to company based in Europe. And if you're a Chinese company or US company, you will not have to comply with those kind of rules, even though you are operating in Europe. So that's a good way. It's a good point for us that everyone that wants to operate in Europe should respect and apply with those kind of rules. That's something that will protect the European innovation, I think, because we all are gonna play with the same rules. Based on that, I think regulation is necessary because AI will probably be something that will impact and change the world in the next decade. So it's important that we have like a regulation about it. But of course, when we don't have any kind of regulation, you don't have to comply and you can go faster, especially when you want to start something and you don't have the team and the time to look at those kind of regulation and comply with it. But anyway, it's normal.
Federico, to what extent should the new rules be willing to compromise a bit more with consumer safety just so that Europe can give birth to the new big AI companies?
It's really one of the interesting aspects of this proposal that we are still assessing is a strong link, namely on the definition of high risk and the relation that high risk AI has with product safety legislation. We note in that perspective that some of the rules that were used in this proposal are already those that are used in product safety. And one of the questions that one can ask is when we talk about AI, which is a standalone service, a standalone software, can we use rules that were you created to regulate the product safety legislation to regulate software? We're not so sure. We're still assessing, but it is definitely a question that we should look into this. And to your specific question, I think AI, we have an opportunity to regulate AI the same way we regulated personal data with the GDPR. And this is something that we Europeans should be proud of. The GDPR is a great regulation that has been enforced for a few years. It has a very specific problem which is related to enforcement. It should be clearly improved, and we should be aiming with this proposal at something similar of what we had achieved with the GDPR. And in this matter, we should be careful to ensure that what is happening with GDPR in terms of enforcement does not repeat itself with the AI proposal.
Can you elaborate a bit more on that part on enforcement?
So that's also one of the shortcomings that we highlight to the AI proposal. If we look, for example, at a consumer that has been harmed for a non-compliant high-risk AI, so an AI system which has not complied with the current rules of the AI proposal, what are the tools, the legal tools made available to consumers to make sure that the company which has not complied will be punished, and that the AI system will be eventually withdrew from the market or deleted in the case of the software. And what we are seeing is that the proposal is quite weak on these type of rules. So it does not establish any type of available tools for consumers in terms of redress options. And one of the elements that is also lacking is, if we look, for example, at the Digital Services Act, which establishes a provision making a link between the Digital Services Act and the Representative Actions Directive. The Representative Actions Directive is the directive that has harmonized collective redress in the EU recently. And the Digital Services Act, when it makes the link with the Representative Actions Directive, it would allow a number of consumers to group themselves and to launch a legal action against a non-compliant online platform in the case of the DSA. And we don't have this same provision in the case of the AI, proposal, which for us is really something that we fail to understand.
Eva, what do you think of the way the current proposal is helping European startups get to the next level and compete with American or Chinese or just foreign startups in the AI environment?
Well, I have to say that it's a step in the right direction, definitely. Europe has been seen as the place where we set the rules and kind of the rest of the world follows. But what would be important now is that we don't just set up the rules, so we are kind of the referee that puts the rules out there on the table for the rest to try to not just comply with them while doing business in Europe or with Europe, but also to implement them back home or make similar sort of legislation to kind of take inspiration from the European rules. But what I think it's most important is that with this rules that we set, we could also enable our players in order to make sure that our SMEs, they could originate from Europe, but they should be seen as global players, strong European players on the global stage. So for me, this proposal has, so to say, two important reasons to get it right, so to say, in the AI field. On the one hand, to try and set up those global rules for ethical AI, and on the other hand, to make sure that European players could flourish, so to say, that they could grow, that they could develop better services or products, and they could compete globally. So in this respect, it's a very important proposal. We have to know that this sort of framework, it means that we cannot kind of put things to work and happen in a vacuum. It doesn't mean that Europe has to shield away also from international standards on AI, but why not be the first one to kind of come up with this sensible approach? And we don't do this because we're in a competition necessarily. We do it because it's necessary. We do it because we took our time. It took quite a lot of months and years, about 3 years, to come up with this proposal. And I'm glad it took us quite some time, because perhaps it would have been rushed if we received it 2 or 3 years ago. I think the Commission had enough time to sit down, listen to all interest parties, and kind of come up with a good balanced proposal. What we see also in today's discussion, in a way, reminded me very much of the work I do on a daily basis. The various groups wanting different approaches, and it's our job to sit down and listen to both. And sometimes when there's too many divergences of opinion, one has to meet perhaps in the middle. And I would finish up with what I started. When you regulate something that is so complex, the legislation cannot be, there's no easy fix in the legislation. It's a complex legislation, and it would, require a lot of listening from our side to make sure that we get the best possible proposal for all parties involved. On the one hand, some are saying that the proposal is not ambitious enough. The others say the proposal is ambitious. And if we have those reactions, means like maybe we so far have some sort of a compromise, because the rules for AI are not proportionate. It will make it even harder for smaller developments to coexist if all AI is the same for everyone, the way there are voices that propose that this sort of so to say, way ahead is taken. The proposed framework already gives a lot of requirements for all actors that are involved in the AI system. And if we go all in when doing a legislation in a certain area, will be something very new, so to say, but it has to be done in a proportionate manner. So I very much hope that if done right, the legislation could deliver very good results for SMEs and those startups that are in the tech domain that could help the traditional SMEs flourish. Thank you.
We have some questions from the audience, and there's one that's specifically addressed to Federico. So this person says, there's a lot of questions, but I'll take the main one. Does Mr. De Silva believe that every single AI system needs to be addressed in this regulation? And he's speaking particularly about indie video games. He's saying, should an AI system that generates new levels in a video game need to be regulated? Should the indie game company have to go through the added burden of compliance?
Thank you very much for the question. I think what is missing here on the question is to understand that not all AI will be regulated in the same manner. So if we're talking about this specific type of AI, which of course I don't know the details of how it works, so we would need to discuss and understand how it should be best regulated. But the idea is really, if we think of the obligation to transparency, the obligation to transparency will vary for low risk, medium risk, and high risk AI, meaning this obligation will not be the same for low risk AI as it will be the same for high risk AI. But the idea indeed is that for all AI, there would be a specific level of obligations. Again, it does not mean that these obligations that we were calling for low or medium risk AI are the ones that are in the proposal. The ones that are in the proposal, which in our opinion, the requirements that are in the proposal, and which in our opinion are not bad, those are aimed at high risk. So here we're talking about replicating key principles, but in a manner that can be used in different levels.
Thanks, Federico. We're going to move to the last questions because we're ending we're reaching the end of the panel. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds each. Lara, we'll start with you. If you had one main part of the legislation that you want lawmakers to address in the legislative process in Parliament and in the Council, which part of the legislation would you want them to look at and improve or change?
Maybe it would be like to ensure that we have enough clarity about compliance and how we should comply and how to do it with having in mind that most of the tech startups, before raising a lot of funds, don't have like huge team to deal with that, and how they can comply with easy paths to do it.
What about you, Federico? Which part, one specific part that you'd want them to work on and improve?
I think I already mentioned, I mean, clearly the scope should be improved, as well as the addition of strong enforcement measures and consumer rights. But I would go back to MEP Maydel's wording earlier on when she said we need to set up global rules. We need to ensure that you players flourish, and I would simply add, and we need to ensure a high level of consumer protection.
Thanks. And Eva, you're the last one. You're the lawmaker. So how are you going to, if you have 30 seconds to tell us how you're going to address Lara's and Federico's concern when looking at the legislation?
Well, I actually think in a way I did address their points already into the discussion, but 2 points that were not raised that kind of for me provide the basis in order to get to those demands and to make sure that those demands are not just properly addressed, but then they could be properly implemented in the way I already, so to say, answered is I think we have important provisions on cybersecurity, for example, that are in Article 15. And I think AI systems can only be strong if, on the one hand, the data is of quality. We have provisions on data governance in Article 10, and if systems are safe and protected. So if we do not also ensure that part, it would be very difficult to have companies that flourish and citizens that are protected. So I would like to also emphasize on these 2 points. Thank you.
Thanks, Eva. Thanks to all of our panelists today, and thank you for joining me for this session. You can stay connected to watch our next panel discussion on algorithm auditing and data security with my colleague Leonie Cater in a couple of minutes. Stay tuned.